The first snow came early that year, sweeping through Wyoming like a whispered warning. Townsfolk took it as a sign the winter would be long and merciless. But for Clara Belle, it wasn't the cold she feared. It was the silence. She stood barefoot on the front steps of her father's farmhouse, her baby swaddled tight in a tattered blanket. Behind her, the door shut with the finality of a rifle shot. The echo of her father's voice still rang in her ears. "We don't raise no bastards here, especially not one with Comanche blood." He hadn't looked at her when he said it. Her mother wept quietly in the background, not daring to speak, and her two older brothers stared at her like she was something shameful that had crept in under the door. Clara had always been the quiet one, the obedient daughter who helped birth the calves and bake the pies, but no amount of virtue had saved her from the rumors, or from the truth, that the baby in her arms had skin a shade warmer than hers, eyes darker than any Belle blood ever carried. The man who had fathered him? Dead. Gone before he even knew she was carrying their child. Shot in a raid that wasn't his fault, but in a town like theirs, guilt didn't need facts. She walked, cradling the baby against her chest, wind slicing through the prairie like knives. No horse, no wagon. Just her, two cracked boots, and the weight of everything she'd lost. Snow melted into the threads of her shawl, then froze again. By the time the town disappeared behind her, she had stopped crying. Clara found shelter in the broken shell of an abandoned trapper's cabin, tucked beneath a crooked bluff. It smelled of damp wood and raccoon scat, but it kept the wind off. She built a fire out of pine branches and broken floorboards. The baby nursed weakly, his lips dry and trembling. She named him Eli, after the man who had once promised to take her to the Colorado River, where water ran clearer than glass. Now, it was just her and little Eli wrapped in silence. Days passed, then weeks. She snared rabbits, boiled roots, melted snow for water. When her hands cracked open from the cold, she wrapped them in torn cloth and whispered lullabies through the pain. No one came looking, and she stopped expecting them to. The worst part wasn't the hunger, or even the fever that struck her one night so hard she couldn't stand. It was knowing she would die out here, and no one would bury her. No one would take her son in. He would starve beside her frozen body. But fate, strange and stubborn as the western wind, wasn't finished with Clara Belle. One morning, just as the sun cracked over the hilltops, she heard it. A horse, hooves slow and steady, not like the frantic gallop of a raider or the plod of a mail wagon. This was one man, alone, and he stopped just outside the cabin. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, heart pounding like a war drum. The door creaked open. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat dusted in snow. A duster coat hung off his frame like it had seen more winters than men. His face was lined, but not old, with eyes the color of rain-heavy sky. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her, looked at the baby, and then he knelt. From his saddlebag, he pulled bread, jerky, a tin of beans, and a battered tin cup which he filled with hot coffee from a flask. He didn't ask questions, didn't lecture or judge, just said, "You look like you could use a hand." His name was Samuel Briggs, rancher, war veteran, a man who had seen enough death to know when life still had a chance. And he looked at Clara not like she was ruined, but like she was worth saving. For days he came, brought wood,
food, medicine. Said little, but always tipped his hat before leaving. He never asked who the father was, never commented on the baby's skin, just asked, "You holding up?" And she answered, "Trying." It wasn't love, not yet. It was something quieter, gentler, the kind of kindness that didn't expect anything in return. In a land where mercy was rare and reputation everything, Samuel Briggs made no excuses for helping her. "Folks say I'm stubborn," he told her once, "but I say there's no shame in calling a blessing what others throw away." She stared at him for a long time, and for the first time in months, Clara Belle smiled. But nothing in the West stayed peaceful for long, especially not when rumors rode faster than truth.
The baby didn't cry much. Perhaps he already knew the world wouldn't be kind to him. Maybe that's why, even as the wind slammed the boards of the abandoned barn and the night howled like a mourning wolf, the child only let out soft, breathy whimpers, as if he didn't want to bother his mother, who, for all the world, looked like she'd shattered somewhere inside. Lena wrapped him in the last dry blanket she had, the rest soaked from the river crossing. Her hands were cracked, her nails ragged. She hadn't eaten in nearly a day, but her eyes stayed wide, alert, not for food, but for danger. She kept waiting for the sound of her father's rifle or the bitter bark of her brother's voice. She half expected them to ride back, not to forgive her, but to finish the shame they believed she'd brought. But all she heard was the creaking of the barn's rusted hinges, the sigh of the wind against old timber, and the breath of her son, rising and falling, just barely. She didn't even have a name for him yet. She had wanted to name him with joy, not grief, but the joy had never come. Only thunder, only silence, only the memory of that last night, when her mother had turned her face to the wall, when her sister had whispered, "You chose this," when they had placed the bag of food by the door without a word and left it there, like an offering to a ghost they didn't want. She'd carried the baby alone since that morning, across hills, through cold, with bleeding feet and a heart so tired it barely beat. But still she'd walked, because somewhere, far across the plains, was a place she hadn't dared believe in for years. A ranch on the edge of nowhere, owned by a man she once knew, back before all this, back when she still laughed, back when his name made her blush. Thomas Callahan. The only one who ever looked at her like she was something more than someone's daughter. The one who once brushed dust off her dress at church and said, "You'll make someone brave enough to stay someday." He didn't know about the baby, or the exile, or the shame hung around her shoulders like an old wet coat. But she remembered his eyes, kind, steady, the kind you trusted without asking why. She didn't know if he'd be there, or if he'd take her in. But in a world where no one wanted her, she had to believe someone still might.
The barn shook again as a gust of wind howled through its seams, and she curled tighter around the child. Her lips brushed his temple. "You were never a mistake," she whispered. "You are not a sin." Her voice cracked. "You are mine, and I'll get us there." Then, through the cracks in the wood, came a faint glow. At first she thought it was the moon, but it moved, closer, warmer, flickering. A lantern. Someone was coming. She tensed, ready to run, even though her legs screamed against the thought. But then a voice, rough, low, uncertain, broke the silence. "Lena?" Her breath caught. That voice. Even the barn went still, like the wind itself was listening. The door creaked open, and against the backdrop of snow and shadows stood a man in a wide-brimmed hat and a coat heavy with dust and years. Thomas! He stepped inside slowly, holding the lantern high, and when his eyes landed on her, wild-haired, pale, clutching a child, he didn't flinch, he didn't ask, he didn't shame. He just lowered the lantern and said softly, "You found me." Lena didn't speak. Her lips trembled. She thought she might break. But the baby stirred in her arms, and for the first time in days she felt warmth. Not from the lantern, but from him. He stepped closer, and when his hand touched hers, she didn't pull away. He looked down at the child, not with surprise, not with judgment, but something else, a slow, aching tenderness, like he saw something beautiful, like he saw a beginning. And in that moment, Lena wept, not from fear, but from the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, they were no longer alone.
Thomas didn't ask questions that night. Not about the baby, not about the bruises under Lena's eyes, or the tears still drying on her cheeks. Not about why a girl once promised to another kind of life was now huddled in his arms inside a broken barn with a child that looked nothing like him. He just led them home, through the snow, through the hush of midnight, across the prairie where only the moonlight dared to speak. He let her lean against his side, one arm steady around her waist, the other carrying the lantern that lit just enough of the world to believe in the next step. The house stood like a promise on the ridge, sturdy, warm, with a chimney that puffed smoke into the stars like a prayer. Inside, the fire was already alive, as if it had known they were coming, as if the walls themselves had waited for her. Thomas laid a blanket on the wide couch by the hearth and brought water, clean cloths, and the softest quilt he owned. Lena sat in silence, her baby curled against her breast, her fingers brushing his cheek, still unsure if any of this was real. But Thomas made no demands. He didn't pry open her story. He didn't measure her worth against the child she carried. He only asked one thing. "You safe enough to sleep?" he murmured, standing beside the fire. She looked up at him. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something deeper than kindness. She nodded, slowly. He gave a single soft smile, touched the brim of his hat, and turned toward the stairs. But then, just as his boot hit the first step, her voice stopped him. "His name is Eli." Thomas turned, his brow lifting just slightly. "That's a strong name." She looked down at the baby. Her voice barely carried. "His father was a Comanche scout. He saved me from a bad thing, stayed with me when no one else would. But then," her words trembled and disappeared. Thomas didn't move, didn't pressure, just waited. She swallowed. "My family said the child would bring ruin, that he wasn't ours, that I wasn't theirs anymore." The fire cracked. Wind brushed the window like an old ghost listening in. "I walked for 3 days after they sent me out. I didn't know where else to go." "You did," Thomas said gently. "You just forgot you could."
She blinked, surprised by the softness in his voice. "I never judged you, Lena. Not back then, not now. You were always more than they let you be." He paused, then walked slowly back to the hearth, kneeling beside her. "Can I see him?" Her arms tightened instinctively. but she nodded. She pulled back the quilt just enough to reveal the baby's face. Dark eyes, golden skin, a tiny mouth shaped like a question mark. Thomas looked at him for a long time. And then, something broke open behind his expression. He reached out, not to touch the child, but to touch her hand, the one holding him. "You gave life," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "when the world gave you nothing." Lena's lips parted. And then he said the one thing no one had dared say since it all began. "You didn't bring shame to your name. You brought a blessing." She choked on a sob, not because it hurt, but because it healed. Thomas stayed there until her breathing steadied, until the baby yawned and curled closer to her chest, until the fire burned low and the shadows crept quietly across the floorboards. And when she finally slept, safe for the first time in months, he sat nearby, hat on his knee, rifle resting by the door, watching, guarding, as if her survival mattered to him more than his own, as if love, once lost, had found a way to stay behind and wait.
Morning came quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned, like peace had finally touched the edges of something jagged. The snow had stopped in the night, leaving a pale blanket across the prairie, unbroken except for one set of boot tracks leading to the door. Inside, the air smelled of firewood, bread, and something soft Lena hadn't known in a long time: safety. She woke not with fear, but with stillness, the kind that reminded her she was alive, that Eli was warm against her chest, his small hand curled around the fabric of her dress. Thomas was already up. She found him outside, splitting wood beside the barn, steam rising from his shoulders as he moved. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet strength in each motion that didn't ask for notice, but earned respect. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, and watched him for a while. Then he looked up and smiled. Not the kind of smile that tried to fix things, but one that simply said, "You're here. That's enough." "You hungry?" he asked, nodding toward the house. She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I could eat." He wiped his hands on a cloth, motioned her inside, and made her breakfast. Eggs, cornbread, coffee so strong it made her cough, and he chuckled once when she did, like music that hadn't been played in years. They didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. But there was a moment, after the dishes were cleared and Eli lay sleeping in the cradle Thomas had pulled down from the attic, that Lena finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest. "Why did you help me?" Thomas looked up from the hearth where he was stoking the fire. She continued, voice soft but sharp-edged. "You didn't owe me anything. You didn't even know what I was carrying." He sat back on his heels, looked at her for a beat, then said simply, "Because somebody should have." That silenced her. He went on, "I saw you in town once, before all of this. You were smiling, wearing yellow. You looked like sunshine." She blinked. "I don't remember that." "I do." And I never forgot how the whole place seemed a little less mean for a minute. But later, when word came that you'd been sent away, that they turned you out like a stray dog. I just kept thinking, someone should have stood up. She lowered her eyes. Her hands trembled. Thomas stood and poured more coffee, then sat across from her. You think you're carrying shame. But what I see is a woman who gave birth to a boy that's half of two worlds and all heart.
She looked at him, disbelief still clinging to her ribs. Most folks say that makes him belong to neither. Thomas shook his head. Then they ain't worth his name. The silence between them grew full, heavy, but not with guilt, only gravity. Lena finally exhaled. He'll never be accepted, will he? Thomas leaned in. He don't need the world to accept him. He just needs one place to belong, same as you. She looked at him, eyes glassy. Is this that place? He didn't flinch, didn't blink. If you want it to be. The fire popped. A wind brushed past the window, and Lena realized, maybe for the first time, that she wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore. She was deciding where to begin again. Outside, the prairie stretched wide, endless, and suddenly possible.
Spring came slowly that year. It didn't rush in with blossoms or bright skies. It crept through the thaw like a whisper, turning frost into dew, silence into birdsong, and bare trees into something green again. And with it, Lena changed. Not overnight, not all at once, but like the land, quietly, steadily, with moments of sunlight between the storms. She began tending the garden behind the cabin, replanting what had long gone fallow. She learned to knead bread the way Thomas did, laughing when it failed and celebrating when it rose. Eli, now bigger, stronger, and always clinging to her skirts, took his first steps on that wooden floor and called the rancher Pa before anyone had even thought to teach him the word. Thomas had said nothing when he heard it, just sat still, blinking fast. But that night, he whittled a tiny wooden horse and left it beside Eli's cradle. A quiet kind of love. It wasn't perfect. They still carried scars. Sometimes Lena woke in the middle of the night, panicked, remembering her father's voice, the sound of the door closing behind her. Sometimes she still looked over her shoulder when someone rode down the road. Fear doesn't vanish just because kindness arrives. But over time, something happened that she never thought possible. She stopped believing she was broken. It came the day they rode to town together. Lena hadn't meant to go, hadn't dared to show her face in that place since being turned out. But the wagon needed supplies, and Thomas had asked gently, "Come with me?" So she went. The whispers came like wind, fast, cold, faces turned, eyes narrowed. But Thomas stayed beside her, hand resting near hers, tall and steady. And then something strange happened. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed at Eli. "He's pretty," she said. "He looks like the sky at night." The mother, older, gray around the temples, paused, looked at Lena, then at the boy, then back at Lena. And she smiled. It was small, but it was real. A chisel in the stone of all that shame. That night, back at the ranch,
Lena walked out to the edge of the pasture while Eli slept. Thomas joined her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Lena said quietly, "I thought I'd be alone forever, that no man could love a child like mine." Thomas looked at her. Moonlight caught his face just right, carving kindness into every line. He said, "I didn't fall in love with a child. I fell in love with a woman who never gave up on him." Her breath caught. "And him?" she asked. Thomas turned to the house, where warm light glowed from the window. "He's just the proof that love doesn't need permission to be holy." She stood there a long while after that, holding those words like prayer beads between her fingers. Later that summer, they married. Not in a church, not in front of her family, but under the cottonwood tree behind the house, where birds sang and wind moved gently through the grass. Thomas wore his best shirt, Lena wore white, and Eli stood between them with a flower crown made from dandelions. A family no one believed in, except the man who'd seen their worth before they even knew it themselves. The world hadn't changed, but they had. And somehow, that was enough.